Welcome back to this week's episode of Save the Nation Today. I'm Hannah Catherine Smith. The threat to free speech on college campuses has become even more perilous over the last few years, and students are not necessarily any more encouraged to engage in open discourse and rational debate. But today, we are celebrating a win at the University of Central Florida. So here to break that down is Cherise Trump, the Executive Director of Speech First. Cherise, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So first, I want to talk a little bit about this win with the lawsuit that you all at Speech First have going on at the University of Central Florida. Tell me a little bit about what was going on there and what we're celebrating today.
Yeah. So University of Central Florida, they had what we call them bias response teams, right? But they called theirs the Just Night Response Team. And a lot of times these go by different names on campuses. And this is one of the policies that we sued the University of Central Florida on because it's so insidious and so pervasive around the country, and we're seeing this everywhere. But it actually is an anonymous reporting system where students they're actually able to report on one another for various things called bias incidents or unwanted speech or offensive speech. And the way that the universities characterize this in their policies is basically anything that could be even the mainstream opinion or like that could actually be, these are all constitutionally protected forms of speech, by the way. And so this is kind of what we're seeing a lot on campuses where they're encouraging students and soliciting reports on various constitutionally protected speech. In addition to the bias reporting system that UCF has, they also have a harassment policy. And they have like a discriminatory harassment policy, which again identifies constitutionally protected speech as forms of harassment that students can report one another on. So like I said, we're seeing this across the country on university campuses. This is a serious problem. But like you said, we have a big win today because we actually appealed our case up to the 11th Circuit. And this was a huge win for us. They unanimously ruled in our favor that these policies are unconstitutional and that they need to be reconciled.
So it sounds like the University of Central Florida has kind of been checked off the list with these bias reporting systems, but it sounds like from what you're saying, this system exists on campuses across the country. What sort of educational toll does limiting free speech on college campuses have in the general higher education experience?
Yeah, that's an excellent question because that's the biggest concern here, right? So we actually just released a report on bias reporting systems across the country. We looked at over 800 universities and found that over half of them have some version of a bias reporting system on the campus. And so this is really concerning because 5 years ago, it was about, maybe a couple hundred. And now we're seeing at least 200% increase on the amount of schools. And that we haven't even looked at every single university. And this is really concerning. It's at private and public four-year colleges that we're looking at. And one of the things we talk about in this report is just what the actual consequences are of policies like this. Students are going to start censoring themselves, right? It's just like stuff you saw in East Germany or under like the Soviet bloc countries, where individuals are afraid that their neighbors are going to report on them, that their peers are going to report on them, sometimes family members. And so they start to really watch what they're going to say. They stop participating in any kind of conversation that could be even remotely close to getting them accused of anything. And again, because the schools have such broad and subjective terminology that they use and what can be reported, students actually don't even know what they can talk about without getting reported. Some students might have just like a general mainstream political opinion on an issue, and they won't even bring that up in a debate because they think that it could actually get them reported. So what's going to happen is, like I said, you're going to see this self-censorship increase. And FIRE released a report last year that said over 80% of students say that they self-censor at least one point or another on campus. And when you think about what's that going to do to future leaders in this country, I mean, they're all going to graduate at some point, right? What if they're not even willing to speak up about anything? What's that going to look like?
Right. It's certainly a scary future to think about what the world would be without free speech in this country. Now, we talked a little bit about the bias reporting system. I also want to zero in on that harassment policy that you mentioned earlier, because certainly I think people hear a phrase like that and they think, okay, well, good. I don't want people to be harassed. What exactly, can we dive a little bit deeper into that and talk about perhaps, it might not necessarily be what it seems?
Yeah, so a lot of universities have been doing this, actually. We've seen it across the board. We actually just filed a case against the University of Houston earlier this year as well on their harassment policy, because schools will take the concept of harassment and they'll define what it is with very broad and subjective terms. So yeah, there is really bad harassment that you do want students to be able to report each other on, or report on and kind of say, okay, I was sexually harassed and this is something that makes me really uncomfortable. But then if, like, for example, you're in the middle of a conversation and someone disagrees with you, and you don't like how they made you feel in that situation, is that also deemed harassment? And the fact that they made you feel uncomfortable in a conversation by proving you wrong in debate? No, that's not harassment. But the way schools define harassment actually opens the door for you to be able to report your peers on those types of situations. And students are actually taking advantage of these reporting systems. That's the scariest thing, right? It's not just a matter of that they have the ability to report on these things. They're actually doing it. They're following through and reporting their fellow students for harassment or to the bias response team for things such as simple as like a puke face emoji in response to a comment online. So this is not, in addition to the self-censorship, it's also creating a culture of snitching, or kind of like censoring, students wanting to censor each other on these issues.
Well, it certainly seems to be a pressing issue for the future generations of America. And so we thank you so much for all of the work that you are doing, Cherise, as well as everyone else at Speech First. Thank you so much for your insight and for joining us today on Save the Nation.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks.